With only 2 hours of sleep in the past 36, Keisha Williams is running on pure determination and caffeine when she makes the mistake that changes everything. She feeds the wrong baby, a tiny Korean infant who has been crying for months, and suddenly he falls silent in her arms. But this baby belongs to Ryong Kim, a man whose expensive suit costs more than her yearly salary. And when he finds her holding his son, his dark eyes see everything she's been trying to hide. At 24, Keisha had learned to function on fumes. She moved through the pristine hallways of Little Angel's private nursery with the efficient grace of someone who had mastered exhaustion, her natural hair pulled back in a protective style that had lasted 3 days too long, her scrubs wrinkled from sleeping in her car between shifts. The exclusive Los Angeles facility catered to families who paid more for monthly childcare than most people earned in a year, all gleaming white surfaces and hushed luxury that felt like stepping into a medical facility designed by angels. Keisha balanced 3 jobs to keep her head above water. Days at Little Angel's, evenings at Mercy General's maternity ward, and overnight shifts at a 24-hour pediatric clinic downtown. $50,000 in medical debt sat on her shoulders like a weight that grew heavier each month, her mother's cancer treatment bills arriving with the ruthless regularity of seasons. She had exactly $2,000 in savings and needed 20 times that to catch up, to breathe, to stop the constant calculation of every dollar spent. The nursery's east wing hummed with the quiet efficiency of wealth. Each room cost more per month than Keisha's apartment, equipped with monitors that tracked every breath, temperature controls that maintained perfect climate, and furnishings that looked like they belonged in a palace. Military-grade security ensured that only vetted staff and approved family members could access the floors, cameras positioned at every angle, guards who looked more like special forces than typical building security. Room 7 had been crying for 37 minutes. The sound carried through the supposedly soundproof walls, a thin, persistent wail that spoke of exhaustion and need. Keisha checked her assignment sheet through bleary eyes, squinting at the paper that seemed to swim slightly in her vision. Room 5. Mrs. Patterson's newborn daughter needed her 4 o'clock feeding. But Room 7's cries were like needles against her tired brain, and her feet carried her toward the sound without conscious thought. The baby was beautiful and miserable, dark hair damp with tears, tiny fists clenched in frustration. 6 months old according to his chart, though he seemed smaller somehow, fragile in the way that spoke of too many sleepless nights. Keisha lifted him automatically, her body responding to years of training and instinct, and settled into the expensive rocking chair beside his crib. The moment she positioned him for feeding, everything changed. His crying stopped as if someone had flipped a switch. His tiny body relaxed against her chest, dark eyes fluttering closed, and his breathing shifted into the deep, peaceful rhythm of a baby finally getting what he needed. Keisha felt the change in her own body, the letdown response immediate and powerful, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of this perfect biological harmony. She had fed hundreds of babies in her years of work, but this felt different. The weight of him in her arms, the way he settled so completely, the absolute trust in his small body as he finally found peace. For the first time in months, Keisha felt useful in a way that went beyond mere survival, like she was exactly where she belonged. "Where have you been?" The voice came from the doorway, low and controlled, with an accent that turned the words into something almost melodic. "What happened here?" Keisha's head snapped up, her heart hammering against her ribs as she took in the man standing in the entrance to Room 7. He was tall and lean, wearing a dark suit that looked like it cost more than her car, with sharp features and black hair swept back with precision. His presence filled the doorway despite his controlled stillness, and his dark eyes missed nothing as they moved from her face to the baby in her arms. "I'm so sorry," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was assigned to Room 5. I just heard him crying, and—" The man stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with deliberate quiet. His movements were fluid and precise, like a predator who had learned to mask his dangerous nature behind expensive clothing and careful control. The custom suit was midnight blue, probably Italian, with a subtle pattern that only became visible when he moved. His shoes were leather, polished to mirror brightness, and his watch caught the soft nursery lighting in a way that suggested serious money. He is sleeping, the man observed, his voice carrying a note of something like wonder. When did this start? Just now, Keisha admitted. He stopped crying the moment I picked him up. I've never seen anything like it. The man moved closer, and Keisha caught the scent of expensive cologne, something woodsy and sharp that probably cost more per ounce than she made in a day. His dark eyes were fixed on his son, but she felt him cataloging everything about her. The exhaustion in her face, the way her hands trembled slightly from too much caffeine and too little sleep, the careful way she held his child as if he were made of spun glass. I am Ryan Kim, he said simply. This is my son, Minseek. And you are? Keisha Williams, she managed. I work here 3 days a week. I just started last month. Mr. Kim, I am so sorry. I know I wasn't supposed to be in here. I just heard him crying and my assignment was room 5, but... Stop, he said quietly, but with enough authority that her words died in her throat. How long has he been sleeping like this? About 10 minutes, she whispered. Ryan Kim was silent for a long moment, studying the scene before him with the intensity of a man who had learned to read situations quickly and accurately. His son, who had cried himself hoarse for weeks despite every expensive intervention money could buy, lay peaceful and content in the arms of a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days. The baby's breathing was deep and even, his tiny face relaxed in a way that Kim had begun to think was impossible. You look tired, he observed, and something in his tone made it sound less like judgment and more like recognition. When did you last sleep? The question was so unexpected that Keisha answered without thinking. 2 hours ago, for about an hour and a half. I work 3 jobs, my mother is sick, I just need to. How sick? He interrupted, and again his voice carried that strange quality that suggested he truly wanted to know. Cancer, Keisha said simply. The treatments are expensive, insurance doesn't cover everything, and I'm trying to catch up on the bills before. She stopped herself, realizing she was sharing far too much with a man who was essentially a stranger, albeit one who could probably have her fired with a single phone call. Before what? He asked. Before they stop her treatment, she finished quietly. Ryan Kim was silent again, but Keisha felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. His dark eyes moved from her face to his sleeping son and back again, calculating something she couldn't begin to understand. The nursery around them was quiet except for the soft sounds of the baby's breathing and the distant hum of climate control systems. You have been here 1 month, he said. How many other babies have responded to you like this? None, Keisha admitted. I mean, I'm good at my job. Babies usually settle for me eventually, but nothing like this. He just stopped, like he was waiting for me. Ryan Kim reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card, black with silver lettering that caught the light. He extended it toward her, waiting until she shifted the baby carefully to accept it with her free hand. Call me tomorrow at 10 in the morning, he said. We need to discuss something. Keisha looked at the card, reading the elegant script that identified him as the CEO of something called Kim Holdings. The address was in Beverly Hills, the kind of location that suggested the sort of wealth that solved problems by throwing money at them until they disappeared. Mr. Kim, I really should take Minseek back to his crib. I need to get to room 5. He is sleeping peacefully for the first time in months, Ryan said quietly. You will stay until he wakes naturally. I will handle any questions about your schedule. With that, he turned and left the room, his expensive shoes silent on the nursery carpeting. Keisha was alone with the baby, whose name she now knew was Minseek, wondering what exactly had just happened and why her hands were still shaking. The business card felt heavier than paper had any right to feel, like it contained possibilities that she was afraid to consider. Outside room 7, she heard the soft sound of conversation, Ryan Kim's voice mixing with what sounded like administrative staff. She caught fragments about schedule adjustments and priority arrangements, the kind of conversation that happened when someone with serious money decided to change the normal order of things. Minseek stirred slightly in her arms, making a small sound of contentment before settling deeper into sleep. Keisha looked down at his peaceful face, at the way his tiny hand had curled around her finger, and wondered if exhaustion had finally made her hallucinate the entire encounter. But the business card was real, solid and expensive between her fingers, and the baby in her arms continued to sleep with a tranquility that felt like something close to magic. Tell me what state you're from. I'm curious where my viewers are watching tonight. The conversation about family and finding peace in unexpected places reminds me of how we're all connected across different places. For the next hour, Keisha sat in the rocking chair and held a baby who slept like he had finally found exactly what he had been searching for. When Minseek woke naturally, blinking up at her with dark eyes that seemed far too wise for his age, she knew that something fundamental had shifted in her small, carefully controlled world. The business card in her pocket felt like a doorway, though to what exactly, she was afraid to imagine. Keisha arrived at Kim Holdings the next morning with 15 minutes to spare, having taken 2 buses and walked 4 blocks to reach the gleaming Beverly Hills office tower. The building was all glass and steel reaching toward a cloudless California sky, the kind of architecture that spoke of serious money and the power that came with it. Security in the lobby was discreet but thorough, guards who looked more like federal agents than typical building personnel, and the elevators required keycard access that suggested not just anyone walk these halls. The 42nd floor housed Ryong Kim's private offices, a space that felt more like an exclusive club than a typical workplace. Rich dark wood paneling lined the walls, leather furniture arranged with careful precision, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that stretched from downtown to the ocean. The air carried the scent of expensive coffee and subtle cologne, and everything from the Persian rugs to the modern art suggested taste backed by unlimited resources. Keisha had spent the previous evening researching Kim Holdings, finding a legitimate real estate and investment company with projects spanning the Pacific Rim. Nothing she read explained why the CEO would personally handle childcare arrangements, or why he had looked at her with such intensity while his son slept peacefully in her arms. The business card in her purse felt heavier than paper, like it contained possibilities she was afraid to consider. 3 years ago, Keisha had been a promising nursing student at UCLA, maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working part-time to cover her expenses. Her dream had been pediatric nursing, working with premature babies and sick children, using her natural nurturing instincts in a career that would provide stability and purpose. Then her mother's diagnosis had changed everything. Patricia Williams had raised Keisha alone after her father's death, working double shifts as a hotel housekeeper to pay for her daughter's education. When the cancer appeared, aggressive and expensive to treat, Keisha had made the only choice that mattered. She dropped out of school to work full-time, taking every shift available to keep up with medical bills that seemed to multiply faster than she could pay them. 3 jobs became necessary when insurance denied coverage for experimental treatments, and sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford. Her nursing skills, half completed but substantial, made her valuable in the private childcare market where wealthy families paid premium rates for qualified care. Now she stood in an office that probably cost more to furnish than she would earn in 5 years, waiting for a man whose son had responded to her touch like he had been waiting his entire short life for her to arrive. "Miss Williams," Ryong Kim said as he entered the office, closing the heavy door behind him with deliberate quiet. "Thank you for coming." He looked different in his own environment, more commanding somehow, though he wore the same expensive clothing and carried himself with the same controlled intensity. His dark suit was charcoal gray today, with subtle pinstripes that only became visible when he moved, and his black hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour. He gestured toward one of the leather chairs arranged around a coffee table that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Coffee," he offered, already pouring from a silver service that had been waiting on a side table. "You look like you could use it." Keisha accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma of what was undoubtedly the most expensive coffee she had ever encountered. The china was delicate enough to be translucent, with a pattern that suggested serious money and excellent taste. "Mr. Kim, about yesterday, I want to apologize again for being in the wrong room. I know the nursery has strict protocols, and my son has not slept through the night since he was born," Ryong interrupted quietly. 6 months of crying that nothing seemed to help. The finest pediatricians in Los Angeles, sleep specialists, every intervention that money could purchase. Nothing worked. He settled into the chair across from her, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. The morning light from the windows caught the sharp planes of his face, highlighting the control that seemed to define every aspect of his presentation. "Yesterday, he slept for 3 hours in your arms. Then last night, after you left, He cried for 6 hours straight. This morning, I brought him back to the nursery early, hoping. Hoping what? Keisha asked when he fell silent. Hoping you would be there, he said simply. You were not scheduled until afternoon, but I had them call you in early. When you arrived and took him, he stopped crying immediately. Again, Keisha set down her coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly as she processed his words. She's been called in early specifically because this man had requested her presence, because his baby son seemed to need something that only she could provide. I don't understand what's happening, she admitted. I've worked with hundreds of babies, but nothing like this. It's like he recognizes me somehow. Children know what they need, Ryong said. Minseek has been searching for something that I could not give him, despite every resource at my disposal. Yesterday, he found it. The office fell quiet except for the distant sounds of Los Angeles traffic far below. Keisha found herself studying Ryong Kim's face, looking for some explanation for the intensity in his voice when he spoke about his son. There was something there, a carefully controlled emotion that suggested depths she couldn't begin to understand. Miss Williams, I have a proposition for you, he said, leaning forward slightly. His voice took on the formal tone of someone accustomed to making offers that changed lives. I want to hire you as Minseek's exclusive caregiver. The words hit her like a physical blow. Exclusive caregiver for the son of a man who could clearly afford anything he wanted. The implications were staggering, but she forced herself to listen as he continued. The position would be live-in at my estate in Malibu. Your salary would be $200,000 per year, paid monthly, with full benefits including health insurance that would extend to your mother. Patricia Williams' medical bills would be paid immediately and in full, and her ongoing treatment would be covered completely regardless of cost. Keisha's vision blurred slightly as the numbers hit her. $200,000. More money than she had ever imagined earning. Enough to transform not just her life, but her mother's chances of survival. The coffee cup slipped in her hands, and she set it down carefully before she could drop it. Mr. Kim, she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. In exchange, I require absolute loyalty and complete discretion. You would be available to Minseek 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You would live on my property, under my protection, as part of my household. You would not discuss our arrangement with anyone outside my organization, and you would not leave the estate without my knowledge and approval. The words sent a chill through her despite the warm office air. Protection. Organization. The implications were clear even if he hadn't stated them explicitly. What kind of organization? She asked quietly. The kind that requires absolute trust, he replied, his dark eyes holding hers steadily. The kind where betrayal has permanent consequences. Keisha felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she processed what he was really offering. Not just a job, but entry into a world where people spoke of protection and consequences, where babies needed exclusive caregivers and offices had security that looked military-grade. You're asking me to give up my independence, my freedom, my life as I know it, she said carefully. In exchange for money. I am offering you security, he corrected. For you and your mother. Financial stability, medical care, safety that I can guarantee absolutely. Your current path leads to exhaustion and eventual failure. Your mother's condition will worsen without proper treatment, and you will work yourself into collapse trying to save her. His words were brutal in their accuracy. Keisha had been running calculations for months, watching the gap between what she earned and what she needed grow wider despite her efforts. 3 jobs weren't enough, and 4 would kill her before she could save anyone. What happens if I say no? She asked. You return to your current situation. 3 jobs, mounting debt, watching your mother fade while you exhaust yourself in a battle you cannot win. Nothing changes except that you will know what you could have chosen. And if I say yes, your mother begins treatment at Cedars-Sinai tomorrow morning. You move to my estate by the weekend. Minseek finally has the care he needs, and you have the security to build whatever future you choose. Keisha closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what he was offering. Everything she had struggled for, everything she had sacrificed her dreams to achieve, handed to her in exchange for caring for a baby who seemed to crave her presence. But the undertones were clear. This man operated in a world where protection was necessary, where loyalty was demanded, where betrayal had permanent consequences. Why me? She asked. You could hire anyone, the best nannies money can buy, people with perfect credentials and references. Because my son needs you specifically, Ryong said simply. Because you have something that cannot be bought or trained. Because when you hold him, he finds peace. The silence stretched between them, while Keisha wrestled with the decision that would define the rest of her life. Her current path led nowhere good. Her mother's latest medical bills sat on her kitchen table, numbers that grew larger each month despite insurance that covered less and less. The treatments that might save Patricia Williams' life required money that Keisha could not earn fast enough, no matter how many hours she worked. But accepting Ryong Kim's offer meant stepping into a world she didn't understand, binding herself to a man whose business required the kind of security that suggested serious danger. It meant trading her struggling independence for gilded dependence, her freedom for her mother's life. I need to know what I'm really accepting, she said quietly. What kind of danger am I walking into? The kind that I will ensure never touches you or your mother, he replied. My protection is absolute, Miss Williams. What threatens my family disappears permanently. The way he said it, with quiet certainty and no emotion, told her everything she needed to know about the kind of man she was dealing with. This was not a corporate CEO making empty promises. This was someone who spoke of permanent solutions to problems with the confidence of experience. Keisha looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city sprawling below, thinking of her mother in a hospital bed, of her own exhausted face in mirrors, of the baby who had slept peacefully in her arms like he had been waiting his entire life for her to arrive. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. It was survival disguised as an opportunity, desperation wrapped in luxury. I accept, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Ryong Kim smiled for the first time since she had known him, a small curve of his lips that transformed his sharp features into something almost gentle. He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a phone, sleek and expensive, sliding it across the coffee table toward her. This is yours now, he said. My number is already programmed. When you are ready to begin, call me. The estate staff will handle moving your possessions and arranging your mother's transfer to Cedars-Sinai. Keisha picked up the phone, feeling its weight as a symbol of everything that had just changed in her life. No more 3 jobs, no more sleeping in her car between shifts, no more watching her mother fade while she fought a battle she could not win. But also no more independence, no more choices made freely, no more life that belonged entirely to her. She belonged to Ryong Kim's world now, whatever that world contained. Thank you, she said, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what had just occurred. Thank you, Miss Williams, he replied, rising from his chair with fluid grace. My son has been waiting for you his entire life. Now he will finally have the mother he needs. The word hit her like a physical blow. Mother. Not nanny, not caregiver, but the role she had dreamed of since childhood and thought she would never have. The role that came with a baby who seemed to recognize her soul, and a man whose dark eyes held secrets that she was only beginning to understand. Outside the windows, Los Angeles stretched toward the ocean under morning sunshine that seemed brighter somehow, full of possibilities that had not existed an hour ago. Keisha Williams had walked into Kim Holdings as a struggling nursing student working 3 jobs to save her dying mother. She was leaving as something else entirely, though exactly what, she was afraid to imagine. What happens next? She asked. You save my son, he replied simply. And I save you. I need to hear more about where you're watching from tonight. Your stories help me understand how love can be found in the most unexpected places. The phone in her hand felt like a bridge between her old life and whatever came next, a lifeline thrown across a chasm that she could not cross on her own. Tomorrow, her mother would begin the treatments that might save her life. This weekend, she would move into a world where babies stopped crying at her touch and powerful men spoke of protection with quiet certainty. Keisha Williams had made her choice. Now she would learn what it truly meant to belong to someone whose love came wrapped in danger and whose protection required absolute trust. The Kim estate sprawled across 15 acres of Malibu hillside, hidden behind gates that looked more like fortress walls than typical residential security. Ancient oak trees lined the private drive that wound up from the coastal highway, their branches forming a canopy that filtered California sunshine into dappled patterns on stone pavement. The main house emerged from the landscape like something from an architectural magazine, traditional Korean elements blending seamlessly with modern luxury. All clean lines and natural materials that spoke of serious money applied with exceptional taste. Keisha's first glimpse of her new home took her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the Pacific Ocean stretching toward the horizon, while carefully maintained gardens showcased plants that must have cost more than her previous annual salary. Security was everywhere but discreet, cameras positioned with mathematical precision, guards who looked more like military personnel than typical estate staff, and technology that hummed quietly in the background like a protective electronic heartbeat. Her quarters occupied the entire east wing of the house, connected to Minseek's nursery by a hallway that allowed her to hear every sound he made. The apartment was larger than any place she had ever lived, with a bedroom that faced the ocean, a sitting area furnished with pieces that belonged in museums, and a bathroom with marble that felt warm under her feet. Everything had been chosen with care, from the soft blues and greens that echoed the view outside to the fresh flowers that appeared daily without her ever seeing who arranged them. The nursery itself was a masterpiece of design and function. Soft cream walls reflected natural light from windows that offered glimpses of the garden, while state-of-the-art monitoring equipment tracked temperature, humidity, and air quality with precision that would make hospitals envious. Minseek's crib was positioned to catch morning sunshine, surrounded by toys and books that suggested someone who understood child development had made every selection. From the moment Keisha settled into the routine, everything felt different. Minseek responded to her presence like a flower turning towards sun, his chronic fussiness disappearing as if it had never existed. He slept through his first night in her care, 8 uninterrupted hours that left both of them refreshed and content. His eating improved, his weight gain accelerated, and his development progressed with the rapid advancement of a child who was finally getting what he needed. Ryong Kim proved to be an unexpected presence in their daily life. Rather than the distant patriarch she had expected, he appeared regularly throughout the day, bringing coffee during evening feedings, sitting quietly while she bathed his son, reading Korean stories during nap time in a low voice that seemed to soothe both baby and caregiver. His expensive suits were replaced at home with casual clothing that somehow made him seem more dangerous rather than less, his controlled intensity unchanged by the domestic setting. 3 months passed in a rhythm that felt both surreal and completely natural. Keisha woke each morning in sheets that cost more than her previous monthly rent, caring for a baby who seemed to thrive under her attention, living in luxury that she had never imagined possible. Her mother's treatment at Cedars-Sinai progressed better than anyone had dared hope, the cancer responding to experimental therapies that would have been impossible without Ryong's intervention. The conversations began during Minseek's afternoon naps, when the nursery fell quiet and Ryong would appear with tea that tasted of jasmine and distant places. He spoke carefully at first, sharing stories about his son's birth that revealed glimpses of pain carefully controlled. His wife had died bringing Minseek into the world, a tragedy that he discussed with the clinical detachment of someone who had learned to bury emotion too deep to easily access. Keisha found herself sharing her own dreams during these quiet moments, describing the nursing career she had abandoned to care for her mother, the pediatric ward where she had planned to spend her life helping children who could not help themselves. Ryong listened with an attention that suggested her words mattered to him in ways she couldn't understand, his dark eyes never leaving her face as she spoke about futures that seemed both lost and strangely possible again. The Korean lessons started accidentally, when Keisha asked about the words he used with Minseek during bedtime stories. Basic phrases at first, simple greetings and endearments that felt strange on her tongue, but seemed to please both father and son. Ryong proved to be a patient teacher, correcting her pronunciation with gentle touches that lingered longer than necessary, his fingers brushing hers as he guided her hands through the gestures that accompanied certain words. In return, Keisha introduced him to the comfort foods of her childhood, simple dishes that filled the kitchen with aromas of home and belonging. He ate her cornbread and collard greens with the same focused attention he applied to everything else, asking questions about ingredients and techniques that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. The kitchen staff, initially suspicious of her presence in their domain, began seeking her advice about American dishes and sharing their own family recipes in return. The estate employees treated her with a respect that went beyond professional courtesy, a deference that seemed to flow from Ryong's obvious regard for her welfare. The head of security briefed her on protocols for emergency situations. The household manager consulted her about Minseek's schedule and preferences, and the gardener showed her the sections of the grounds that were safest for walks with the baby. Everyone seemed to understand that she occupied a position of importance that went beyond typical household staff. For the first time in years, Keisha felt safe. Not just physically secure, though the estate's protection was comprehensive and constant, but emotionally safe in a way that allowed her to sleep through the night without calculating medical bills or counting hours until her next shift. She watched her reflection in the bathroom mirrors change as exhaustion faded from her features, as proper nutrition and adequate rest restored the vitality she had forgotten she possessed. But even in this protected paradise, signs of outside danger began to appear. Strange cars parked on the coastal highway with clear views of the estate entrance, remaining just long enough to be noticed before disappearing. Security briefings became more frequent, with personnel she had never seen before appearing for discussions conducted in voices too low to overhear. Ryong's phone conversations switched to Korean when she entered rooms, his tone suggesting tensions that had nothing to do with business deals or investment strategies. The changes in him were subtle but unmistakable. His controlled intensity increased by degrees, his attention to security details becoming more pronounced, his conversations with staff carrying undertones of preparation for something unspecified but serious. He moved through the house with the fluid alertness of someone expecting trouble, his expensive casual clothing doing nothing to disguise the fact that he was a man accustomed to violence. One evening, as Keisha settled Minseek for his nighttime feeding, she finally asked the question that had been growing in her mind for weeks. Why are you doing all this? Really? The money, the protection, everything. What do you get out of this arrangement? Ryong was quiet for a long moment, watching his son's peaceful face in the soft nursery lighting. His response, when it came, was careful and measured, like someone choosing words from a limited vocabulary of acceptable truths. My son needs what you give him, he said finally. Peace. Security. The kind of maternal love that cannot be purchased or simulated. You provide that. But what about you? She pressed gently. What do you need? Something flickered across his features, an emotion quickly controlled but not quite fast enough to escape her notice. The vulnerability lasted only seconds, but in those brief moments she saw past his controlled exterior to something raw and carefully hidden. I need to know he is safe, Ryong said quietly. I need to know that someone will love him the way his mother would have, if she had lived. I need to know that my failures will not define his life. The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with meanings that she was only beginning to understand. This was not just about childcare arrangements or financial transactions. This was about guilt and loss and the desperate need to protect what remained of a family torn apart by violence and circumstance. Outside the nursery windows, the Pacific Ocean reflected moonlight in patterns that shifted with each wave, beautiful and constant and somehow reassuring. But beyond the estate's protective walls, something was building in the darkness, threats that required the kind of security that surrounded them every day. Keisha could feel it in the increased tension among the staff, in Ryong's carefully controlled vigilance, in the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms. 3 months ago, she had been a struggling nursing student working 3 jobs to save her dying mother. Now she lived in luxury beyond imagination, caring for a baby who seemed to recognize her soul, protected by a man whose dark eyes held secrets that she was only beginning to glimpse. The transformation felt both miraculous and fragile, like a perfect moment balanced on the edge of forces she could not control. As Minseek drifted off to sleep in her arms, Keisha wondered what storms were gathering beyond their protected paradise, and whether the safety she had found was strong enough to weather whatever was coming. The baby's peaceful breathing filled the quiet nursery, a sound of contentment and trust that had become the soundtrack of her new life. But even in this moment of perfect peace, she could feel change approaching like distant thunder, carrying the promise of tests that would determine whether the family they had built together could survive the dangerous world that surrounded it. Where are you joining us from tonight? I love hearing about the communities watching and how these stories of unexpected connections resonate with your own experiences. In the morning, she would wake to another day in paradise, caring for a child who had claimed her heart and learning to navigate the complex loyalties of a world where protection came at prices she was only beginning to understand. For now, though, there was only the weight of a sleeping baby and the quiet presence of a man whose controlled exterior masked depths that called to something fundamental in her soul. The conversation that changed everything began on a Tuesday evening in late autumn, when coastal fog rolled inland from the Pacific and wrapped the estate in gray silence that muffled even the sound of waves against distant cliffs. Minseek had been particularly fussy that day, his usual contentment replaced by the restless energy of a teething six-month-old, and it had taken longer than usual to settle him for the night. When Keisha finally emerged from the nursery, she found Ryong waiting in the hallway with 2 cups of traditional Korean tea, his expensive casual clothes replaced by a simple black sweater that somehow made his controlled intensity more pronounced rather than less. His private study occupied the west corner of the main house, lined floor-to-ceiling with books in Korean, English, and what appeared to be Japanese, the volumes bound in leather that suggested both age and careful preservation. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames dancing behind glass that cast shifting shadows across furniture chosen for comfort rather than display. The room felt different from the rest of the house, more personal somehow, with photographs that he kept nowhere else and art that spoke of emotional connection rather than investment value. Keisha had never been invited into this private space before, and she felt the significance of crossing its threshold like a physical weight settling around her shoulders. The tea was jasmine and something else, herbs that carried the scent of distant mountains and careful tradition, served in cups so delicate they seemed to glow with internal light. "You have been here 6 months now," Ryong said, settling into the chair across from her with movements that suggested exhaustion carefully controlled. His dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, though his voice remained quiet and measured. "You have given my son something I could not provide, despite every resource at my disposal." "He seems happy," Keisha replied, uncertain where this conversation was leading. "Content. Like he finally has what he needs." "What he needs is a mother," Ryong said simply. "Someone who loves him unconditionally, who would protect him with her life, who sees him as the center of her world rather than a responsibility or obligation." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meanings that she could sense but not quite grasp. Outside the windows, fog pressed against glass like something alive, isolating them from the world beyond the estate walls. "His birth mother," Keisha said carefully. "Can you tell me about her?" Something flickered across Ryong's features, a crack in the controlled exterior that revealed depths of carefully buried pain. He was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeing scenes that existed only in memory. "Her name was Sujin," he said finally. "We met in Seoul when I was building what would become my American operations. She was a pediatric nurse, brilliant and kind, everything good that existed in a world that had shown me mostly darkness." His voice took on a quality she had never heard before, soft with remembrance, but edged with something that might have been guilt. "She knew what I was, what my business required, but she believed I could change, become something better than what circumstances had made me. When she became pregnant with Minseek, I promised her I would leave that world behind, build something legitimate that our son could inherit without shame." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, flames casting shifting patterns on walls lined with books that suddenly seemed like witnesses to confessions too long held secret. "What happened?" Keisha asked quietly. "The Park family happened," Ryong replied, his voice taking on the flat tone of someone reciting facts too painful for emotion. "A rival organization that saw my transition to legitimate business as weakness to be exploited. They wanted my territory, my connections, my resources. When I refused to negotiate, they made their position clear." He rose from his chair with fluid grace, moving to the fireplace where photographs lined the mantel like shrines to memories. He lifted one, a picture of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, holding an ultrasound image against her rounded belly. "They attacked the hospital while she was in labor," Ryong continued, his back to Keisha as he studied the photograph. not to kill her directly, but to send a message about what happened to families of men who opposed them. The stress, the fear, the complications that followed. She died bringing Minseek into the world because I was too focused on protecting my business to protect what truly mattered. The admission fell between them like a stone into still water, creating ripples that seemed to spread through the warm air of the study. Keisha felt her heart constrict as she processed the magnitude of loss contained in those carefully controlled words. "I built this estate as a fortress," he said, turning to face her with eyes that held pain like physical weight. Every security measure, every protection protocol, every precaution that money and experience could provide, all designed to ensure that what happened to Sujin could never happen again. The vulnerability in his voice was almost too intimate to witness. This carefully controlled man allowing walls to crumble in a way that felt like a gift and a burden simultaneously. Keisha understood now why Minseek's contentment mattered so much to him, why her presence in their lives carried weight beyond simple childcare arrangements. "You blame yourself," she said softly. "I failed to protect her," he replied simply. "I was so focused on building power that I forgot why power mattered. Now I have everything I thought I wanted, but my son will never know his mother because I could not see the threats clearly enough to stop them." The confession hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, visible and substantial and impossible to ignore. Keisha felt tears gathering behind her eyes as she processed the depth of guilt and loss that had shaped every interaction she had witnessed between father and son. "Minseek needs what his mother would have given him," Ryong continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his footing in painful truths. "Love that asks for nothing in return, protection that comes from instinct rather than obligation, someone who sees him as a gift rather than a responsibility. You provide that. And what about you?" she asked gently. "What do you need?" "I need to know he will be safe," Ryong said, moving back to his chair with movements that seemed weighted by invisible burdens. "I need someone I can trust absolutely to love him the way Sujin would have. I need to know that my failures will not define his future." The study felt smaller somehow, as if his revelations had drawn the walls closer together, creating a space where truth could exist without the careful controls that defined the rest of his world. Outside, fog continued its silent assault on the windows, but inside the firelight created warmth that went beyond mere temperature. "You give him peace," Ryong said, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made breathing difficult. "When you hold him, when you sing to him, when you simply exist in his presence, he becomes the child he was meant to be rather than the anxious baby that fear and loss created. You heal something in him that I could not reach." "And you?" she asked quietly. "Do I heal something in you too?" The question seemed to surprise him, though his expression revealed nothing of whatever internal calculation her words had triggered. The fire crackled in the silence that stretched between them, creating a soundtrack for admissions that felt too large for the room that contained them. "You make me remember why any of this matters," he said finally. "When I watch you with him, I see the family that Sujin dreamed of, the peace that she believed was possible even in our dangerous world. You remind me that I am more than just a man who eliminates threats and accumulates power." The sound that interrupted them was subtle, the kind of electronic alert that spoke of serious security systems responding to genuine concerns. Ryong's entire demeanor shifted in an instant, controlled intensity becoming something harder and more focused as he reached for a phone that had appeared in his hand without her seeing him draw it. The conversation was brief and conducted in rapid Korean, but Keisha could read the tension in his body language even without understanding the words. When he ended the call, his features had hardened into the expression of a man accustomed to making decisions that others would find impossible. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her already knew that their peaceful evening had just ended permanently. "The Park family has found us," Ryong said simply, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of a predator preparing for violence. "Surveillance detected around the perimeter. Intelligence confirms they are moving tonight." Keisha felt ice forming in her stomach as the reality of his world crashed into the protected paradise she had grown accustomed to. This was what lived beyond the estate walls, what required the security measures and protection protocols that she had begun to take for granted. "What does that mean?" she asked, though her voice sounded strange and distant to her own ears. It means the people who killed my wife have come for my son, Ryong replied, his voice taking on the flat tone of someone who had learned to function under pressure. It means the life we have built here is about to be tested in ways that will determine whether it can survive. The security alert sounded again, more insistent this time, and Keisha heard the sound of vehicles moving with urgent purpose somewhere outside the study windows. The fog that had seemed romantic and isolating moments before now felt threatening, a cover that could hide any number of dangers approaching through the darkness. Go to Minseek, Ryong said, his tone carrying absolute authority. Lock the nursery door and do not open it for anyone except me. If something happens to me, the staff have instructions to get you both to safety. The casual way he discussed the possibility of his own death sent terror racing through her veins. This was not theoretical danger or abstract threat. This was immediate and real, and closing in around the sanctuary she had thought was impregnable. Ryong, she began, but he silenced her with a look that contained everything he could not say about what the next few hours might bring. Protect him, he said simply. Everything else is negotiable. As alarms began to sound throughout the estate, and the careful peace of their protected world shattered like glass against stone, Keisha understood that she was about to learn exactly what it cost to love someone whose enemies were willing to kill children to make their points. The fog outside the windows suddenly seemed full of shapes and possibilities that would determine whether the family they had built together could survive contact with the violent world that had created it. The man who had shared his deepest secrets with her over jasmine tea was gone, replaced by someone whose controlled exterior masked capacities for violence that she was only beginning to understand. But his final words echoed in her mind as she ran toward the nursery where an innocent baby slept, trusting in protections that were about to face their ultimate test. Could you share what state you're watching from tonight? These stories of family and protection always remind me how we're all connected across different places and experiences. Everything else might be negotiable, but Minseek's safety was absolute, and she was about to learn exactly what that meant in a world where love and violence existed in the same space, where protection required the kind of strength that she was only beginning to discover she possessed. The nursery felt like a sanctuary under siege, thick walls and reinforced windows designed to withstand exactly this kind of assault, but still somehow fragile against the sounds of controlled violence that echoed through the estate. Keisha had barricaded herself and Minseek in the reinforced safe room adjacent to his nursery, a space that Ryong had shown her during her first week, but that she had never expected to use. The baby slept peacefully in her arms despite the distant sounds of conflict, his small body warm and trusting against her chest, while her own heart hammered with terror and adrenaline. Hours passed in a strange suspended state where time seemed both endless and compressed. The sounds of the conflict were muffled by the safe room's construction, but she could still hear vehicles moving with urgent purpose, voices raised in coordination, and occasional sharp reports that her mind refused to identify too specifically. Through it all, Minseek remained calm, as if her presence created a bubble of peace that external violence could not penetrate. When the electronic locks finally disengaged and the safe room door opened, Keisha's breath caught in her throat at the sight of Ryong Kim standing in the entrance. He was still wearing the black sweater from their evening conversation, but everything else about him had changed. His dark hair was disheveled, his clothing bore stains that looked suspiciously like blood, and he carried himself with the loose-limbed relaxation of someone who had just finished extremely violent work. Most unsettling was the faint metallic scent that clung to him, sharp and unmistakable beneath his expensive cologne. The Ryong who had shared painful memories over jasmine tea was gone, replaced by someone whose controlled exterior could no longer quite contain the dangerous capabilities that his legitimate business facade usually masked. His dark eyes swept the safe room with professional thoroughness before settling on her face with an intensity that made breathing difficult. "It is finished," he said simply, his voice carrying the flat exhaustion of someone who had just done necessary but distasteful work. "The Park family will no longer be a concern." Keisha felt relief and horror warring in her chest as she processed the implications of his words. The casual way he spoke of eliminating an entire criminal organization suggested capacities for violence that her mind struggled to fully accept, even as her heart recognized the absolute safety that his success represented. "Are they dead?" she asked quietly, surprised by her own need to know the specifics of what he had done to protect them. "The leaders are no longer operational," Ryong replied, moving into the safe room with fluid grace that somehow emphasized rather than concealed the predator that lived beneath his expensive clothing. "Their organization has been dismantled permanently. The threat to our family is over." Our family. The words hit her like a physical blow, carrying implications that went far beyond employer and employee, far beyond the business arrangement that had brought her into his world. She looked down at Minsik, still sleeping peacefully in her arms, and realized that somewhere during the terror of the past few hours, something fundamental had shifted in how she understood their relationship. "You were afraid," Ryong observed, settling into the chair across from her with movements that suggested bone-deep weariness. His dark eyes studied her face with the intensity she had come to associate with his complete attention. "But you stayed. You protected him." "Of course I stayed," Keisha replied, her voice stronger than she expected. "Where else would I go? He needs me." "Yes," Ryong said quietly. "He does. We both do." The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with meanings that she was only beginning to understand. This was no longer about childcare arrangements or financial security. This was about something deeper and more complex, something that had been building during months of shared meals and quiet conversations, and the simple intimacy of caring for a child together. "I heard some of what happened," she said carefully. "The sounds. I know what you had to do." "And how does that make you feel?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been vulnerability. "Knowing what I am capable of when my family is threatened." Keisha was quiet for a long moment, processing the complex emotions that warred in her chest. The man who had just eliminated an entire criminal organization to protect her and Minsik was the same one who brought her coffee during late-night feedings, who read Korean stories in a voice soft enough to soothe both baby and caregiver, who had shared his deepest grief over jasmine tea in a room lined with books and memory. "It should terrify me," she admitted finally. "And part of it does. But mostly it makes me feel safer than I have ever felt in my life." The confession surprised her with its honesty. She should be horrified by the violence, by the casual efficiency with which he had removed threats to their peace. Instead, she felt protected in a way that went beyond physical security, cherished in a way that had nothing to do with salary or benefits or contractual obligations. Ryong rose from his chair and moved toward her, his expensive casual clothing doing nothing to disguise the fact that he was a man who had just proven exactly how far he would go to protect what belonged to him. When he reached the couch where she sat with his sleeping son, he knelt beside them both, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You are not just my employee anymore, Keisha," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You have not been for months. What happened tonight? What I did it for my family. For both of you." The words sent heat racing through her veins despite the terror of the evening. Family. Not staff, not hired help, but family in the way that mattered most to a man whose power and resources meant that such distinctions carried life and death significance. "You are mine now," he continued, reaching out to touch her face with fingers that were gentle despite what they had recently done. "Both of you. I protect what belongs to me, and I do not share. Do you understand what I am telling you?" The possession in his voice should have frightened her, should have triggered every independent instinct that had carried her through years of struggle and self-reliance. Instead, she felt something deep in her chest settle into place like a piece of herself that had been missing finally sliding home. "I understand," she whispered, leaning into his touch despite the metallic scent that clung to his skin. "But you should understand something too." "What?" he asked, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "You are ours too," she said, shifting Minsik carefully so she could reach out and touch the sharp line of his jaw. "This broken, dangerous, beautiful man who would eliminate armies to keep his family safe. You belong to us just as much as we belong to you." The surprise that flickered across his features told her that no one had ever claimed him with such certainty, that his entire adult life had been about protecting and possessing rather than being possessed in return. The vulnerability that followed the surprise was almost too intimate to witness, this carefully controlled man allowing walls to crumble completely. Forever, he said, and the word carried the weight of a vow. Forever, she agreed, and felt something settle into place between them that had nothing to do with contracts or arrangements or the financial security that had brought her into his world. When Ryong leaned forward to kiss her, Min-sik stirred slightly in her arms but did not wake, as if even in sleep he understood that his family was finally complete. The kiss was gentle despite the violence he had just committed, tender despite the danger that would always exist at the edges of their protected world, and full of promises that had nothing to do with money or obligation or the practical considerations that governed most relationships. "We should discuss the future," Ryong said when they separated, his forehead resting against hers while Min-sik slept peacefully between them. "Legal arrangements, security protocols, the kind of life we want to build together." "What kind of life do you want?" she asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "The kind where you wake up in my bed every morning, where Min-sik grows up with the mother he needs, where the family that Soo-jin dreamed of finally becomes real." "And what would that make me?" she asked quietly. "Your wife. If you will have me," he replied simply. "If you can accept what I am, what our life will require, what loving me means in a world where enemies exist and protection requires constant vigilance." Keisha looked down at the baby in her arms, this innocent child who had brought them together through his simple need for maternal love. She thought about the evening's violence, about the metallic scent that still clung to Ryong's skin, about the fact that loving him meant accepting a world where threats were eliminated permanently and family was protected by any means necessary. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and strong despite the magnitude of what she was choosing. "All of it. The danger, the protection, the kind of love that comes with bodyguards and safe rooms and men who disappear when they threaten what matters most." The smile that transformed Ryong's features was unlike anything she had ever seen from him. Joy and relief, and something deeper combining to create an expression that made him seem years younger despite the evening's violence. "Tomorrow I will arrange for the marriage license," he said, reaching out to stroke Min-sik's dark hair with fingers that were gentle despite their recent work. "Tonight, we begin the life that we should have been living all along." Outside the safe room, the estate was quiet again, security teams completing their cleanup with the efficient thoroughness of professionals who understood exactly how to make problems disappear permanently. But inside their protected sanctuary, a family was finally acknowledging what they had become through months of shared meals and quiet conversations, and the simple miracle of a baby who had found peace in unexpected arms. "What region are you joining us from tonight?" These stories about finding family in unexpected places always remind me how love can appear when we need it most, no matter where we are. The violence was over, the threats eliminated, and the future stretched ahead of them full of possibilities that had nothing to do with the business arrangement that had brought them together. Keisha Williams had entered Ryong Kim's world as a desperate woman seeking salvation for herself and her mother. She was staying as something else entirely, as the woman who had claimed his heart and given his son the maternal love that money could never purchase. In the morning, there would be practical arrangements to make, legal documents to sign, and the kind of life to build that required both infinite tenderness and absolute ruthlessness. For tonight, though, there was only the weight of a sleeping baby and the quiet presence of a man whose dark eyes held promises that she finally understood she could trust completely. 8 months later, Keisha Williams Kim stood in the nursery of their Malibu estate, watching 14-month-old Min-sik take his first independent steps across the soft carpet toward her outstretched arms. His delighted laughter filled the room as he wobbled forward with the determined concentration of a child who had finally mastered the mechanics of upright mobility, his dark eyes bright with the confidence of a baby who had never known anything but absolute security and unconditional love. The transformation in all their lives had been complete and miraculous. Min-sik had grown into the happy, healthy child that nature had intended him to be. His early months of constant crying now just a distant memory replaced by the easy contentment of a toddler who trusted his world completely. His vocabulary included words in both English and Korean, his favorite being the Korean word for mother that he used exclusively for Keisha, as if some deep instinct recognized what she had become to him regardless of biology. The wedding had taken place in the estate's garden 3 months after the night that eliminated the Park family threat, a small ceremony attended by Keisha's mother and the household staff who had become their extended family. Patricia Williams had walked her daughter down the stone pathway between roses that cost more than most people's monthly salary, her recovery from cancer so complete that her doctors spoke of miracles and second chances. The marriage license made legal what had already become true in every way that mattered, binding together a family that had formed through need and grown into something that felt predestined. Ryong had proven to be everything that his quiet intensity had promised and more. Behind the controlled exterior that had first intimidated her lived a man capable of infinite tenderness with those he claimed as his own, someone whose protective instincts extended to anticipating needs before they arose and ensuring that safety never felt like imprisonment. The man who eliminated threats with ruthless efficiency was also the father who spent hours on the nursery floor teaching his son to stack blocks, the husband who brought coffee at precisely the moment when she needed it most. Their daily life had settled into rhythms that felt both luxurious and completely natural. Mornings began with breakfast on the terrace overlooking the Pacific, Minsik in his high chair babbling commentary, while Keisha and Ryong planned their days around his schedule and the legitimate business operations that provided cover for resources that went far beyond typical corporate profits. The Korean language lessons had evolved into fluent conversations that allowed her to understand the phone calls that had once seemed threatening, business discussions about shipping schedules and real estate acquisitions rather than the dangerous activities she had once imagined. The estate staff treated her with the deference due to the wife of their employer, but also with the genuine affection of people who had watched her transform from a desperate young woman into the confident mother and partner she had become. The head of security consulted her about protocols that affected Minsik's safety. The household manager sought her preferences for everything from menu planning to holiday decorations, and the gardener had created a special section of child-safe plants where their son could explore without concern. Most significantly, Keisha had returned to her nursing education through private tutors and online programs that Ryong had arranged, her interrupted dreams finally receiving the attention they deserved. The irony was not lost on her that the man whose dangerous reputation had once frightened her was also the one who ensured she could pursue the healing profession that had always called to her soul. 3 evenings each week, she studied pediatric nursing with instructors who came to the estate, preparing for boards that would allow her to complete what she had started years ago. The guest house where her mother now lived sat nestled among the oak trees that lined the eastern boundary of the property, close enough for daily visits, but far enough to provide independence that Patricia Williams treasured despite her gratitude for the medical care that had saved her life. The older woman had adapted to their protected lifestyle with surprising grace, finding purpose in helping care for her grandson while maintaining the dignity of someone who understood that acceptance of generosity was sometimes the most loving choice available. Legal arrangements had been completed with the thoroughness that characterized everything Ryong considered important. Adoption papers established Keisha as Minsik's legal mother. Financial trusts ensured security that would extend beyond any single generation, and business partnerships provided legitimate sources for resources that might otherwise attract unwanted attention. She was no longer just the woman who cared for his child, but his partner in building something that could outlast them both. The transformation extended beyond practical arrangements to the fundamental ways they understood themselves and each other. Keisha had discovered reserves of strength that she had never known she possessed, the confidence that came from being cherished by someone whose love was demonstrated through action rather than mere words. Ryong had found peace in ways that surprised them both, the constant vigilance that had defined his adult life softening into protective awareness rather than defensive expectation. Afternoons often found the three of them in the garden, Minsik exploring under their watchful eyes while they planned futures that seemed both ambitious and completely attainable. They discussed the possibility of siblings for their son, additional children who would grow up with the security and love that circumstances had denied both their parents. The nursery adjacent to their bedroom already showed signs of preparation for expansion, though they had agreed to wait until Minsik was walking steadily before adding to their family. But even in their protected paradise, they remained aware of the realities that had brought them together. The security measures that surrounded their daily life were comprehensive and permanent, staffed by professionals who understood exactly what they were protecting and why such protection was necessary. The legitimate business operations that funded their lifestyle were built on foundations that could withstand scrutiny while concealing activities that required absolute discretion. Their love existed in a context where safety was earned rather than assumed, where family was protected by any means necessary. On this particular afternoon, as Minseek successfully navigated his first independent journey across the nursery floor, Keisha felt the completion of something that had begun with exhausted desperation and grown into contentment beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. The baby who had once cried inconsolably now laughed with pure joy as he reached her arms, his trust in her love as absolute as his confidence in his own safety. Ryong appeared in the nursery doorway, drawn by the sound of his son's laughter, his expensive suit replaced by casual clothing that emphasized the domestic happiness he had found in ways that surprised them both. His dark eyes held the satisfaction of a man who had finally achieved what mattered most, who had built something worth protecting through methods that others might question, but that his family would never have cause to doubt. "He is ready for a brother or sister," Ryong observed, settling onto the carpet beside them as Minseek practiced his new walking skills with determined concentration. Someone to teach these steps to. Keisha felt warmth spreading through her chest at the suggestion, the idea of expanding their family both thrilling and completely natural. The love that had grown between them was large enough to encompass additional children, their resources sufficient to provide security and opportunity for whatever size family they chose to create. "Soon," she agreed, watching as Minseek wobbled toward his father with arms outstretched. "When he is ready to share our attention." The baby reached Ryong and was immediately swept up into arms that held him with the careful strength of someone who understood exactly how precious such moments were. The three of them formed a picture of domestic contentment that would have been impossible to imagine when Keisha first walked into Little Angel's private nursery, exhausted and desperate, and making mistakes that would change the trajectory of all their lives. From that first accidental feeding to this moment of complete family security, the journey had required courage that she had not known she possessed, trust in a man whose reputation should have terrified her, and acceptance of love that came with protections most people could never imagine. The woman who had once counted dollars to keep her mother alive now lived in luxury that felt both surreal and completely natural, married to a man whose dark capabilities served the single purpose of ensuring their safety and happiness. As evening approached, and they moved through the familiar rituals of dinner and bath time and bedtime stories told in two languages, Keisha reflected on the strange paths that had brought them to this place of peace. The mistake that had seemed like the final catastrophe in a life already overwhelmed by impossible circumstances had instead been the beginning of everything she had ever wanted without knowing how to ask for it. Minseek fell asleep in her arms as he had every night for the past 8 months, his breathing deep and peaceful as she sang the lullabies that had become their tradition. Ryong sat nearby, reading business reports in the soft light of the nursery lamp, his presence a constant source of security that had transformed from intimidating to comforting to absolutely essential. "I love hearing about your own family traditions and where you're watching from tonight. These connections we build across distances remind me how family can be found in the most unexpected ways." Outside their protected windows, the Pacific Ocean reflected moonlight in patterns that shifted with each wave, beautiful and constant and somehow reassuring. The world beyond the estate walls contained dangers that would always exist, threats that required the kind of vigilance that surrounded their daily life. But inside their sanctuary, there was only love and laughter and the absolute certainty that they were exactly where they belonged. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new challenges to meet with the strength they had discovered in each other, new opportunities to build on the foundation they had created. Tonight, though, there was only the weight of a sleeping child and the quiet presence of the man whose dark eyes had first seen past her exhaustion to the love she had to offer. Keisha Williams had walked into his world as a desperate woman making careless mistakes. She was staying as Keisha Kim, wife and mother and partner to someone whose protection she would never have cause to doubt. The transformation was complete, the family secured, and the future stretched ahead of them full of promises that she finally understood were guaranteed by love that would eliminate any threat to their happiness. Forever had never seemed more possible or more real than it did in this moment. With her husband's quiet strength filling the nursery and their son sleeping peacefully in arms that would never let him fall.